There is a way to start planning about risk exposure. It's called the risk exposure method. Pretty straightforward. So you look at it and you look at traditional methods that you rely on the likelihood of an occurrence and the impact of the magnitude that could have for each individual risk. Let's see, how many of us are going to worry about a 120-foot tsunami? Would we ever think about a 120-foot tsunami coming into even an island nation like Japan? I cannot think that even the worst type of an analyst would even visualize that aspect of it. A nuclear meltdown. Who would have thought that? Who would have thought that six giant plants would be out of commission? It's almost impossible to visualize that, except that really is what the risk exposure method is all about. No, you're not going to probably have that type of equation, but you take on taking little pieces out and try to analyze what's going to happen with that. And we call that risk exposure. A lot of times it's lying as RE when you're actually working in the world of risk. So risk management. You take and you look at the different weave that you have between all the different aspects of it, and let's take one section out, one segment, one mode of your supply chain out, and what would happen? Take it out for 2 weeks. Are you backed up enough in the process? Do you have enough redundancy in your system that you can go around a missing plant because that plant has been taken offline? Do you have that? What would you do if that didn't happen? Do you have any contracts lined up? Even to something as simple as if you're a service company. Okay, what would happen if you had a tornado coming through your region and it knocked down trees across your road? Do you have contracts already in place to actually go through and have trees removed off of your private roads in the aspect of making certain you have that? You already have the contracts in place that you would get first priority. Think about the different aspects of what it takes for a risk exposure process. One time I had a situation where I had a really good groundskeeper who really wasn't using his head. He picked up a 500-gallon gas tank and he's going uphill with it on the front of a high-low, and all of a sudden the entire thing tipped over, and he was soaked to the skin with fuel. And fortunately, it wasn't a gas-powered vehicle. It was a matter of is electric, and he didn't burn to death in the process. All of a sudden, now we had 500 gallons of fuel going down into the drain, and we had everything lined up in case he had a crisis like this, except for the fact that the people who had been trained in it never thought about it. We had stuff there to soak up the 500 gallons. All of a sudden, we found that the 500 gallons went right to a drain that drained into a local swamp. And all of a sudden, I have 500 gallons spreading across 5 acres of standing water, ready to have an environmental impact. Who would have thought that could possibly have happened? If somebody told us that scenario, we would have laughed about it, thought, oh, yeah, right. Okay, you've been having too much to drink at nighttime, get a different life and everything else in the process. But it did happen. What would happen if? What if you pulled that one strand out of there, whether you're a production or a service company in the process? What would happen? What would you do? So think about the risk exposure method and how tightly woven it is. Take one out and then figure out about the TTR, or the time to recover. So on your RE model, figure out the time to recover. What would happen if you had a node and something happened? Take it out, that node, whichever node that is in the supply chain. What would happen if that was gone for 2 entire weeks? One plant had some type of a disaster. You don't even have to sit down there, identify the disaster. It is just gone. So pay attention to what would happen. What would happen to the bill of material? What would happen if both the computers were knocked out? If you have a redundant computer base, do you have that over here? Do you have another way of actually having your information stored someplace else? What if you had a hacker come in and go ahead, lock up all your corporate files, and all of a sudden they put ransomware in? Do you have something else backed up so you have a nightly backup on a regular basis for all your corporate files somewhere in a vault someplace else? You might lose a day's data or a week's data, but do you have something so that you don't lose all the data that was locked up by some type of hacker? So figure out the different aspects of what happens for each product. Do you have all the different aspects as you take one node at a time for the duration of the TTR, or the time to recover in the process? And you want to look at your risk exposure index And the largest impact, you score that as a 1.0. That's the biggest one. And then everything else scales down from that. So that way you can start rating your different parts of the node as to what's the most critical. Really look at your REI with every single node. Your worst one that you have, if it's damaged, is a 1.0, which is your biggest one, and then every else is some derivation of it that's at a lower base. At its core, you want to have a linear optimization program based upon a structure similar to this. Identify the hidden exposure that you might have with each individual risk, which each mode is in the process, what would happen there. Sometimes just one node, if you sit down and then look on the inside of that node, is there one or two factors that could take down the whole operation? If so, can you sit down and have some simple fix to have multiple different aspects of it, multiple different ways to get around that particular operation? This is all about what risk management is all about. And you, if you're working on the entire supply chain, it depends where you're at. But if you're this one factory and you have one line that does this, do you have a redundancy on the inside? You can actually pick up things and have a second line going in an emergency situation within X number of days. A bottleneck. A bottleneck is called the bottleneck because everything's constricted to that one teeny tiny point, and that one point keeps you from filling the entire rest of the bottle because of the fact that everything has to go through that one point. So that being said, figure out what that risk exposure is, look for the bottlenecks that you have in the process, and then analyze it for your time to recover for that risk exposure. Ford Motor Company did that. They analyzed two scenarios. The supplier's production facilities disrupted for 2 weeks, okay, and the tooling had to be replaced, halting operations at its facility for 8 weeks. Now, by the way, just so you know, in the automotive industry, it's pretty common on a traditional automotive industry that they actually go through every summer, they actually shut down a factory for 2 months when they retool everything to come in with a new body style. Nowadays, in this century, we've gotten away from that a lot, from the old tradition in the previous century where you shut the whole plant down. Now it's a much faster process. You're not shutting entire lines down all the time, but literally they would come in with new dies to change them out, to change how the shape of the car would look for the people that are buying the new model, trying to differentiate them in the process. Now we're seeing a change, but the reality of being shut for 8 weeks is actually a practice within the automotive industry. So figure out what that happens over there. So Ford has a multi-tier supplier network with long lead times for some suppliers, and they really have a complex building of material structure. They have a buffer inventory. They have different buffer inventories or safety stock at different locations. So by the time it was all done, they're really the REI model shows about 61% of supplier sites would have no impact on forced profit if they were disrupted. That means they have enough redundancy that the vast majority of a supply chain would continue without that thing being shut down totally. About 2% of supplier sites would, if disrupted, have a huge impact on forced profit. That's where you sit down and focus in as you this is number one for risk exposure, 1.0, because that 2% is going to damage the entire thing and have a huge impact on forced profits. The 61% back here, okay, you don't have to worry about that as much. Now, you do have to worry about it to make certain that you want to have everything flowing well, but that's not going to damage the entire profitability of the company. It's this 2% that would disrupt everything. That's what you pay. But the reality is you must go through a risk exposure review to make certain that you're finding that 2%. A lot of suppliers hadn't been identified by the company's risk managers as high exposure suppliers before that. Everybody was treated the same. Well, the reality is it's not the same. You can have everything built, like for instance, Toyota during COVID, they had everything all set except the computer chips. They ran out of them and they had over 100,000 cars parked over in Tennessee that needed computer chips. They simply didn't exist, and the cars sat there for months waiting for chips to show up, and the body style became outdated because there's so many cars, and Toyota lost a massive amount of money just over a bunch of computer chips. So that being said, Ford was able to identify the supplier sites that required no special risk management attention and those that need to have a thorough disruption mitigation plan to make certain they're all out there. So the risk exposure method is a big deal. check out each node individually, check out the various potential level risk, with your worst one being 1.0 and everything else being some derivation of that. And you don't know what you don't know until you go check out what you don't know. Then you know what you don't know. Take care.